So yeah, my name's Ian. I'm doing a dual role here in that I'm filling in for the economist at DNR. So half of this will be a little bit like what I think the DNR person would have said. And then, I think you saw Morgan's clearly in the major leagues. I kind of want to see, am I in single A or double A? Or maybe, Morgan's a good pitcher. I want to see if I can hit off a really good pitcher. So I'm going to do a little bit of like Morgan did. So look, we can, I guess if we want to try to look at some numbers about how Colorado is doing, Colorado is doing really well, right? We produce a lot of energy. We consume relatively little, and the prices aren't too bad, right? So the main takeaway is that we're pretty good. And if you're looking at these numbers, basically, bigger numbers mean sort of lower down in the ranking. And so if it's how much you're spending on electricity, you want to be lower down, right? And if it's how much you produce, you want to be higher up. So from the Energy Information Administration, the best we can say is Colorado's doing pretty well. We produce a lot of stuff, and the cost that it takes us to consume it is not very high. And of course, as Morgan referred to, right, a number of these things are world markets. So you could try to tell a story that, oh, Colorado produces it, of course it's cheap here. No, it means nothing, right? We produce oil here means nothing to the price of oil, right? Price of oil is determined in a global market. So Colorado's doing pretty well. If we think about moving forward a little bit, I always like looking at weather predictions. So, demand for natural gas for electricity is heavily dependent upon the weather. So if we want to know what's going on with these prices in the near future, we have to look at what's going on, with the weather. So I will say, if you're thinking about what's going to happen in the summer, I guess if you can put bets on, Excel stock or electricity company stock, natural gas prices, they're probably going up, right? Where do people live in the United States? Kind of that mid-Atlantic, Texas, right? Prediction is above average summer temperatures, which means lots of air conditioning demand. Right? There's probably a reason we all live here. I don't know, North Carolina looks like hell this summer, right? Above average temperature and above average precipitation, right? 100 degrees and raining. That sounds awful. So, but for the people in North Carolina, that looks like what their summer is going to be. But if we take this information, if we take what we already know, right, so today the EIA put out their estimate of natural gas storage, right? We're well above the 5-year average. The U.S. has a lot in storage. But we have these issues of potentially high temperature in the summer. We also know, right, as everyone talked about already, right, snowpack super high. Snowpack super high means lots of hydro production, which means less gas consumption in the West. So we have kind of these two conflicting forces on natural gas prices. We're going to have more hydropower this summer for sure, but we're going to have more electricity demand. So before I saw this, this picture, I was thinking natural gas prices were going to go down, but now I'm not so sure, right? If basically all the places where people live have really hot summers, we're going to have really high natural gas demand. So put together, electricity and natural gas prices are probably going to kind of stay where they are, right? We don't look like we're going to have a bad summer. We got a lot of gas in storage. We got a lot of hydropower to help out, but it's going to be super hot, so there's going to be lots of electricity demand. So guess would be, natural gas prices and electricity prices are going to stay kind of where they are, based off what we can guess going forward. This was a chart that the DNR person had in their graph, and if you're interested what's going on with Colorado energy permitting, right? All I really did, this isn't really even math, it's just download an Excel file that's on COGCC's webpage, right, and graph it. So permits going up and down. I can't see any trends in there. I actually did this almost like 8 months ago. The graph looks exactly the same. The rate of permitting across the state seems pretty constant. No trends up, no trends down, something like that. So if you're wondering what's going on in the rest of the state, no pattern, right? Up, down, up, down, up, down. What's going to be going on in the rest of the state that might matter, in addition, is just, right, has been discussed a little bit, but I don't know if it's in the same way, right? There's just a crazy amount of money coming down the pipeline from the federal government, right? Hydrogen hubs, mineral workforce development. Obviously, there are a couple other school of mines, and sorry if anyone went to South Dakota or Montana School of Mines, but every person I talked to in the federal government never heard of those. They heard of Colorado School of Mines. So things like mineral workforce development, they're coming to us. So there's lots of interest in, money coming into Colorado for mineral workforce development, lots of interest in hydrogen hubs. I know the Northwest Colorado Development Council is pretty interested in that, right, with the potential changes to Craig's operation in the Trapper coal mine. Got a lot of hydrogen hub discussion. Carbon capture and storage was also discussed here. Lots of interest in that. To be fair, I'm not as bullish as the previous panel was. In Colorado, there's a lot of interest in ethanol plants. And so, because basically we have ethanol plants nearby, so there's a lot of deals being signed for ethanol plants. But again, still a lot of money going into this, and then potentially, people drill wells to store those things, building some CO2 pipelines. Battery supply chain issues, actually they've kind of ignored Colorado. If you look at the map that DOE put out last week on where is the battery supply chain investments going, it's basically the Southeast and maybe Ohio, places like that. They're kind of ignoring the Mountain West for some reason. And as I'll get to in a second, there are these issues. They have these things called energy community tax credits, so you get extra bonus in your tax credit for making investment in certain communities. They have a definition within the law, but basically most of Western Colorado falls under this. So if you make energy investments, you get 10% extra on your tax credits in these areas. I believe it was last week that the IRS kind of came out with more formal designation of these. These were the guesses that people had, but Northwest Colorado seems like a place to invest. You're going to get an extra 10% on your tax credits from the federal government. The one issue that's been discussed a little bit, and I think that DNR probably would have spent a little more time on than I have so far, right? We heard about this thing called pore space. Kyle explained it very well, right? People who have space under the ground, you pay them to put CO2 in there. That seems like a decent source of revenue in the future for the state or for local areas. Not really well formed out how that's going to work. All of my friends in Texas or Wyoming, basically, they're like, hey, we know what leases for natural gas and oil look like. Just cross out the word oil and put pore space and have people sign that. It's a little bit odd. Normally, these things aren't, the price of or the value of the carbon that you're putting underground is not really variable. Oftentimes we write these oil and gas lease contracts as a way to share risk, right? It's whatever, 12, 15% of the revenue from the sale of oil and gas. Carbon's only worth whatever 45Q says it's worth, right? All these projects are for carbon capture and storage, so it's $80. That number's not changing unless the government raises it again. So we don't really need a risk-sharing contract here, but people are just saying like, well, that, again, we have these contracts, let's just use those. So this is a potential new source of revenue coming in, this idea of some place to put the carbon in the pore space. I've had some interesting conversations recently where people are worried that landowners are getting too much for their pore space. It doesn't support the economics of a CCS project. I kind of think, well, isn't that like how the housing market works, right? If people put the price of a house up too much, then it comes back down because nobody wants to buy it. But anyways, this is a concern amongst a number of folk in the CCS space that landowners are asking too much for their pore space. So perhaps if you see some more recent deals, perhaps they're inflated, and that's not really what it's going to be, what it's going to look like moving forward. Okay, so that was my attempt to be DNR. Now this will be my attempt to be Morgan. So I'll say it's an opinion of what's ahead, and hopefully, you can tell me why I'm wrong. I always like to learn, what is it I'm missing? What is it I don't understand, right? So Morgan already stole this thunder a little bit, right? So lots of people project things. They're always wrong. They're wrong, right? But some of them can be useful, right? What I like to talk about here a little bit is like kind of the way things look like they're going to move forward and where there might be opportunities. And in case you have to leave in the next 30 seconds, my main takeaway, right? Mild reshoring push. We're going to get some things moving back to the U.S. because it's not going to be a big one because we have really large difficulties in permitting. That's going to lead to probably regional price disparities, and that's going to lead to, if you have an operating asset right now, boy, do I want to be you. Because if you have an operating asset right now, basically no one's coming to compete with you, right? Because they can't get their permit to open those things up, to open up something to compete with you. So I guess if it's the business development, group or the strategy group, you have an operating asset, man, figure out a way to get, every penny out of that, because no one's going to be able to compete with you. there's been a number of discussions here, as someone brought up HR 1 before. The thing I found most interesting out of HR 1, and if you look at the Federal Permitting Steering Improvement Committee, none of those things are, federal stuff is getting a little bit better, but then things get stopped at the state and local level, right? So HR 1 is hoping to improve the federal process, but if you talk to folk like the National Mining Association, they're like, yeah, that's kind of fine, but their problem isn't only federal. Their problem is also state and local. So whether you want to call it, NEPA's a 4-letter word, right? Whether we don't like NEPA or NIMBYism, right? It's really, I have a hard time seeing how we're solving both of those at the same time. So permitting anything is going to be seeming to be really hard. And again, that doesn't really matter whether it's green or whether it's brown, right? My favorite story was I spent about a year in Maine. My wife is from Maine. They were going to build natural gas, or they were going to build some electricity transmission lines from hydro up in Quebec down to Boston, right? And like everything else, it was up for a vote, and people said, "Oh, you think you're being green because you're getting hydropower? Well, you have to cut down trees to make electricity transmission, so you're not green, right?" And you just think, maybe like Morgan's thing said, right? There's math, and then there's talking to people, and you're like, okay, right? Like you cut down some trees to build a transmission line, you think that's bad? Like, come on, right? Like these things. So it doesn't matter whether it's green or brown. It's really hard to build, most anything. I kind of look, we're in a state, obviously, that has some, we'll say, clean energy goals. There are lots of states that don't, or that are pushing even the other way, right? So this all-above strategy for the whole United States is probably going to be what we see continuing because, state like Ohio isn't saying they're not saying we don't like renewables. They're saying we want to double down on gas and coal, right? So we're going to have there's this fractured energy system where some states are pushing heavy fossil and some places are pushing heavy renewables. So overall, it's going to look like all of the above, right? So, and this is going to obviously these are going to lead to these different ebbs and flows of prices, of demand. This is the spring. We're going to see a lot of news stories about renewables being 100% of the grid. It's because, of course, demand's way down in the spring, right? It's 50, 60 degrees out. No one's got heating demand and no one's got cooling demand. So, if your total demand is much smaller, it's easier for something like renewables to take the whole thing, right? So we're going to keep seeing, I think, kind of these ebbs and flows. Success, 100%, renewables today. And then, oh crap, the grid failed because we didn't have enough electricity, for either a really cold day or a really hot day or something like that. So there seems to be a bit of interest in, more interest in downstream, right? So the Biden administration clearly came in with a policy of get the car companies to start building EVs here. As Morgan mentioned, right? Midstream for minerals, all done in China. Mining, done all over the world, but definitely not done here. That wasn't the Biden administration's goal, right? The goal was get Ford, GM, all those kind of people to build the cars here. So, and if you listen to what people are actually doing with mining and that midstream where they're trying to figure out how to take the dirt from the ground and turn it into something useful, it's manufacturing. So there's very little interest in mining at the federal level or in any level, right? But manufacturing is of interest, and so all of these processing facilities for minerals are called manufacturing. So we could probably expect to see more interest in downstream facilities, see downstream facilities move in, but less going upstream. Now, because all of these systems kind of have high, basically got to kind of run them all the time, that's going to be a difficult scenario. So when we get into the idea of these regional price differences, we saw what happened when Suncor went down. And I must say, I also, I totally did not do a good job with that, what happened with Suncor, because I said, there's gasoline pipelines, there's refineries around. We're not going to see that big of a movement up because Suncor went down. And of course, national gasoline prices went like that, and Denver prices went like that at the same time, right? So, but that's what's going to just kind of keep happening, right? So if you got to run your refinery 90% of the time, and gasoline demand is kind of flat to falling, right? Because generally gasoline demand has not been keeping back up with the late 2010s. all of a sudden people are going to say, well, I'm not going to run this refinery at 50%. I'm just closing it, and I'll let make sure the other ones stay at 90%. Well, what happens when you close a refinery, right? Yeah, maybe when demand is relatively low, it's fine. We can move the gasoline around. But when demand kicks up, then we're in trouble. So I see a lot of more kind of regional price spikes as some of these midstream assets close, or these midstream assets aren't able to open up. And under normal circumstances, or in a nice April day where it's not too hot, not too cold, perfect, right? When things are stressed, that's when we're going to have problems, right? So we're going to see this kind of spatial disparity in prices. This was not really as big of an interest for us here in the center of the country, right? But if you're familiar, some of you may be familiar with the Jones Act, right? Our waterway system is just pretty difficult to handle. It can't operate as well as other countries. So I just don't see much changing along the logistics standpoint. Because some of these supply chain issues, yes, we might reshore some things, but we're still going to kind of either face the same problems or face worse problems moving forward, just as ports aren't able to keep up, ports aren't able to be dredged. If you're familiar with Port of Corpus Christi or Port of Houston area, they'd love to bring in bigger ships to export oil. They can't. They can't get a dredger to dredge out that port to get a bigger ship in. They do the reverse lightning, if you're familiar, right, where they take smaller ships. There's a bigger ship outside of port, bring in a smaller ship, fill it up with oil or crude products, move it out into the middle of the sea, then put it into the bigger ship. Adds a decent amount, to the price, and so we're not as competitive from a trade perspective. But yeah, I don't see any of that changing. And I have my own stories if anyone's interested. If anyone's a Jones Act, either Politico or really interested in Jones Act, I have my own stories of dealing with some of those issues. So here's where, again, I kind of see some potential opportunities. So yeah, again, if you have a permitted operating asset, man, you are in a good shape, right? Interest in doing things back in the U.S., potentially more difficulty getting things from overseas, and no one else can do hey, let's try to do that. You've got the market to yourself. As we've seen, right, we have places like GM investing in a lithium mine here in the United States, downstream facilities like automobiles, really excited to try to figure out how to make some of these things happen, like electric vehicles. So a lot of downstream production facilities looking for help. Again, if you're the only game in town, some of you might be familiar with the White Mesa Mill in Utah, right? Only uranium processing facility in the US. Yeah, great. Hey, we want more nuclear power. Energy Fuels is all right. Guess where you have to, where do you have to process? Would you like to process it in Russia? How's that going to sound, right? The only place you can go is here, right? So, but again, I don't see full kind of friendshoring / reshoring where we don't have, we're not buying things from China, we're not buying things from other foreign suppliers. So, you're not totally on your own, you're not totally a monopolist, but for anyone who's interested in local production, yeah, if you have something operating and moving, man, you're in the money seat. How do we get out of this scenario, right? Well, we can let ourselves build things. That seems difficult, right? We all saw what happened to Manchin's permitting reform bill. We all saw, we all see what's happening to other ways to try to build things around the United States, whether it be state or local restrictions or federal. Could we have easier way to move things around the world? Again, we can try to get rid of the Jones Act, or we can try to put money into our ports and waterways. That doesn't seem like it's happening, right? Jones Act is from 1880s to 1920s. It's been there since then. Not going away anytime soon. And so then you go to what I think most people in the federal government have tried to go to. Is well, let's build a better mousetrap, and then maybe that'll work. So, and that's kind of what you see, I feel like, in Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act and the IRA. Let's hope that better technology comes and gets us out of all these problems, because we can't tackle the problems. We got to try to, invent our way out of it. So, anyways, that's my attempt to. I think I've already said a number of these things, but that was my attempt to A, pretend I'm DNR, and then B, pretend I'm Morgan. Hopefully, it was at least entertaining for folks. Yeah, that's a good question. So, if you're trying to get something permitted, what are the things that tends to be getting in the way, and how can we get over them? And I have to say, I wish I could point to a success story, right? So Thacker Pass, the lithium mine in Nevada, right now has all its permits and is supposed to be starting operation. But I think as there was discussion going on with the BLM, right? Guess what happened? People are still suing to try. Yeah, you got your permits, but I'm going to sue to stop you, right? And I think it's super easy to say it's somebody who's not from here, but in a lot of ways it's larger entities. Maybe or we might say like not the local community that's suing, although sometimes it is, right? So yeah, it's fairly difficult. It's fairly difficult, even like I said, even if someone has their permit, to see that they're going to carry through with it. So now, how do we get around this? I mean, that's obviously like the $64 question or whatever. That's if we knew, or if I knew that, right, I wouldn't be here. I'd be on a beach somewhere, with a ton of money, because I would have figured out. We would have had all these things solved. I don't know. So clearly, there's two ways people have gone about it. The Republican Party has gone with, if you don't let this happen in the U.S., you're bad because child labor and Chinese are bad, and you're helping the Chinese. So that's kind of the Republican, seems like the Republican response. And the Democratic response sort of seems to be something will come up. We can just recycle the stuff. We don't need mining. We can just recycle things. Or that's kind of when I talk about minerals with folk. That's where, or something like we need a just drastic reduction in energy demand, right? So, which are both, and both sides, right? It's in some either disingenuous or not realistic, right? So it just feels like everybody knows where the pinch point is, but they don't want to, because it's the pinch point. They don't want to touch it. They know it's too hard to touch. I think we can all look at sort of what happened around the Inflation Reduction Act and the permitting reform. I think we all thought Senator Manchin seemed to have lots of influence on that bill, but he couldn't get permitting in it. That seems like illustrative about how much of a red flag some of that stuff is. Certainly the stories of the legislature the legislative stories that I've heard is even when the Republicans were in charge, that was still, that was, again, nothing happened there, right? When the Republicans had the Senate and the House, they didn't pass permitting reform either, right? So it's not like I don't think you can blame one side, for lack of a better word. So yeah, it's really tough to figure out what is the way out of it. And yeah, there are people who, I must say I'm a little bit, I don't know what the word is. So I hear stories from people say, well, you just have to engage the local communities and that will work. And part of me thinks, so there's companies out there that are like not talking to the local community? Like something tells me companies know that you should talk to the local communities before you try to start a project. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong, but even some of the conversations here, companies understand this. And again, sometimes it's from not in the local community that are against a project. And so then, and sometimes, how do you go talk to the local community if it's somebody from outside, for lack of a better word? But yeah, no, that's a good question. Hopefully Thacker Pass becomes like the way, and that one moves, and everybody goes, okay, just do like that. But I don't know if people are familiar with the Twin Met copper and nickel mine in Minnesota. It put in I heard some people today say, oh yeah, 18 months to get a permit. If you're familiar with Twin Metals, permits were put in I think 2007. They got their final permit in 2019. It's 12 years, right? They got sued on a state level permit that held up things, and then the Biden administration pulled those metals from the public domain. So, and that was in 2022. So permit went in 2000. Like we knew about this deposit, right? Permit goes in like 2008. 2022, they get the project's dead. So if you're an investor, you were sitting there for 14 years being like, are we making any money yet? Yeah. So yeah, I guess it's just hard to see. With examples like that, it's hard to see what's the way forward, right? You need to find a positive one, and hopefully people can follow that.